They said the chambers of the royal arena smelled of roses and myrrh, but no perfume could hide what really happened inside those walls. In that perfumed silence of Persepolis, a girl no older than 15 knelt as attendants painted her body with oils meant for queens. They told her this was the highest honor a woman could receive in the empire. She knew better. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold desert air that slipped through the marble corridors, but from the truth she dared not speak. She wasn't afraid to die. Death was mercy compared to what awaited her. The guards called her princess, but titles meant nothing here. In the eyes of the man she would face tonight, the man the world worshipped as a god, she was just another possession. They say the body never lies. Hers didn't. Her back curved under invisible weight, her lips pressed together in silence, her eyes hollow as if 40 years had passed in 15. She had stopped dreaming long ago. Before we dive deeper into this descent, make sure to help this small channel grow. Hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss any of our darker historical explorations. And to understand why the King of Kings turned his own blood into victims, we must go back to the roots of his empire and the birth of his madness. Xerxes came into the world in 519 BC, born inside the heart of a kingdom that touched 3 continents. The Persian Empire stretched from the banks of the Indus to the edge of Greece, from the burning sands of Egypt to the cold peaks of the Caucasus. 50 million subjects obeyed his father's word. Darius I ruled from palaces carved in stone and gold, where the air itself seemed to bow before him. When Xerxes was born, priests proclaimed him chosen by Ahura Mazda, god of light and order. They didn't raise him as a boy, they raised him as a deity. At the Royal Academy of Susa, Zoroastrian magi drilled the same lessons day after day. You are the living reflection of the divine. Your thoughts are sacred. Your will is law. They never spoke of humility or philosophy. They taught him the theology of absolute power. Every feast, every ceremony reinforced it. At sunrise, servants recited hymns to his name. At meals, nobles tasted his food first to prove their loyalty. Even the way courtiers approached him, never turning their backs, never making direct eye contact, told him he wasn't human. When a child grows up believing he's a god, compassion becomes weakness. His mother, Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, only deepened that corruption. She had seen dynastic chaos tear through royal lines, brothers poisoning brothers, mothers plotting against sons. She whispered into Xerxes' ear, "Only complete control guarantees survival." That lesson hardened him. He learned that love must be owned to be safe. That loyalty could never be trusted unless it was enforced through fear. By 20, when his father's death placed the crown on his head, Xerxes believed the empire itself was his body and its people, his veins. Provinces and persons made no difference. Both existed to serve his will. His early reign was soaked in conquest. He crushed uprisings in Babylon with a precision so brutal that even his generals flinched. In Egypt, temples were burned, scribes impaled, rebels left on stakes along the Nile as warnings. The message was clear: defy him, and the gods themselves would not protect you. But the true test came when he turned his eyes west to Greece. For Xerxes, the campaign wasn't just war, it was theology. To subdue Greece was to prove his divinity. He ordered a bridge of ships across the Hellespont, so his army, nearly 1 million strong, if Persian chroniclers can be believed, could march over the sea itself. When storms shattered the bridge, Xerxes did the unthinkable. He commanded his men to whip the sea with chains, to brand it as punishment for defying his will. He threw shackles into the water and declared the Aegean enslaved. To his followers, it was divine theatre. To everyone else, it was madness. Then came Salamis. The Persian fleet burned like torches on black water. Months later, at Plataea, his ground forces were slaughtered. For the first time, the man who called himself immortal tasted failure. And when a god realizes he can bleed, he doesn't become human, he becomes something far worse. Xerxes returned to Persepolis in 479 BC. The triumphal procession stopped. The grand feasts ended. He no longer met foreign emissaries. Courtiers whispered that his eyes had changed, always searching the shadows, as if he expected betrayal at every corner. His orders grew erratic. He executed architects for choosing the wrong shade of tile, had generals flayed alive for questioning him. His empire, once ruled by strategy, now bent to paranoia. But the most disturbing transformation took place behind those 15-meter walls of the imperial arena. What had begun as a dynastic custom, the royal harem mutated into an obsession. Within that walled labyrinth lived 360 official concubines and countless slaves gathered from across the empire, girls from Egypt, Babylon, Lydia, India. Every month, new ones arrived in gilded caravans, chosen not for lineage, but for beauty. The arena was a world of its own, a city inside a prison. Its marble baths shimmered under gold lamps, but its windows were barred. The scent of jasmine masked fear. No woman who entered ever left. Eunuchs guarded the gates, even generals were forbidden entry. Only Xerxes walked freely there, wrapped in silks and silence. From this gilded captivity, daughters were born, dozens, perhaps hundreds, but they were invisible in the royal records. They weren't acknowledged as princesses, had no names carved into stone tablets. They existed as shadows, children of the god king, raised to know their bodies belonged to him. Years later, one of the palace's chief guardians, Mithridates, would whisper to conspirators about what he'd seen inside those walls. His testimony would end Xerxes' reign and stain his legacy forever. He said, "The beginning of the end came in 471 BC, 6 years after Greece humbled the empire. That year, the emperor crossed a line so monstrous that even his closest advisors fell silent. At the center of it was a girl barely 12 years old. Raised under imperial etiquette, she carried herself like nobility. Her eyes were green like polished jade, her hair dark as obsidian, her face eerily reminiscent of her grandmother, Atossa. And that resemblance awakened something in Xerxes that defied reason. Court officials would later call it divine fixation. Others called it insanity. From that moment, the empire's most powerful man began spiraling toward a darkness no priest could bless away. What he did next would make even his enemies pity the royal bloodline of Persia. The encounter was prepared as if the gods themselves required it. Every movement, every breath inside the arena followed the precision of a sacred rite. Servants dressed in white moved silently, their eyes fixed to the floor, repeating gestures learned from generations of obedience. The girl was told she would take part in a divine ceremony, an act of cosmic importance for the empire's balance. No one told her the truth. That night changed the emperor forever. The man who once commanded armies, who dreamed of uniting the known world, never returned from that chamber. What came out instead was something colder. Someone determined to prove that even as his empire weakened, his authority remained absolute. This was never a story about desire. It was about domination, the point where greatness and tyranny fuse so tightly that they devour everything around them. By 468 BC, Xerxes' reign had become a shadow of its former glory. The palace, once a symbol of order and splendor, now pulsed with quiet dread. Inside its walls, a new hierarchy emerged, rigid, cruel, and meticulously bureaucratic. The young women of the arena were catalogued like tribute from conquered lands. Their names, ages, and physical traits filled scrolls stored in cedar chests. The most favored were reserved for the emperor himself. The rest were traded like currency, offered to governors, envoys, and noble families in exchange for loyalty. Childhood didn't exist in this world. There were only ranks of servitude. The guardians of the arena, led by senior eunuchs, developed an administrative system rivaling that of the empire's armies. They recorded every audience, maintained schedules, rationed perfumes, ointments, and medicinal herbs. Nothing escaped documentation. What happened behind those golden doors was treated with the same precision that Persia used to collect its taxes or deploy its legions. The mothers, imprisoned in adjoining quarters, could do nothing but watch. Some resisted and vanished within days. Others broke under the pressure, losing their minds in silence. Most learned to survive by pretending not to see. Yet no one suffered more than the daughters themselves. They grew up in a world where obedience was holy and fear was mistaken for piety. There were no words in their language to describe what was done to them. They lived in a kind of emotional exile, hiding inside themselves. Their bodies told stories they could not speak, sunken shoulders, trembling hands, faces drained of life. Some never spoke again. Others laughed uncontrollably, as if madness were the only form of escape left. Xerxes watched this decay like a man observing his own reflection in a cracked mirror. His eyes had lost warmth. What he sought wasn't pleasure, it was submission. He had lost Greece, but within the walls of Persepolis, he found new territories to conquer, the minds and spirits of those who couldn't resist him. Artabanus, captain of the royal guard, was one of the few men who witnessed the empire's descent firsthand. His duties required his presence near the inner palace, though he could never intervene. He later wrote that at night, Persepolis sounded like a temple of despair. The mixture of muffled cries, whispered prayers, and silences that hurt more than screams. The empire smelled of incense and decay, but it wasn't the death of enemies that haunted him. It was the death of a civilization rotting from the inside. Absolute power demands accomplices, and Xerxes had plenty. The Persian elite knew. They dined under golden ceilings while pretending ignorance. They justified their silence, not with loyalty, but with self-preservation. Many profited directly: new estates, tax exemptions, political marriages sealed by favors from the arena. Corruption had become the empire's second religion. Even the Zoroastrian high priests, the supposed guardians of moral order, offered divine cover for the king's sins. From the fire altars of Persepolis, they proclaimed that the King of Kings ruled not just over men, but over all creation. To challenge him, even within his household, was to defy Ahura Mazda himself. Some priests went further, claiming that the royal daughters were extensions of the emperor's sacred essence, vessels of his divine light. To oppose his will, they said, was heresy. The court physicians added their own layer of complicity. They prepared herbal tonics and ointments designed to mask bruises, to dull pain, to erase visible traces of the rituals. Reports were written in coded medical terms so no outsider could understand what had been treated. Everything was done quickly, quietly, efficiently. But the most devastating betrayal came from within. The older daughters, women who had already endured the same fate, became assistants in preparing the younger ones. They combed their hair, applied the oils, repeated the same comforting lies once told to them. They didn't act out of cruelty, but from despair. Participation was survival, refusal was death. In that twisted world, the family itself had turned into a mechanism of control. The circle of abuse fed on its own pain, perpetuating itself through fear and hopelessness. Mithridates, the chief guardian of the arena, the same man who would later confess everything, kept mental records of every night, every ritual, every disappearance. He said the emperor's hunger wasn't for pleasure, but for affirmation. Each act of cruelty reminded Xerxes that he still commanded fate, that he was still a god in a world that had dared to humiliate him. In his later confession, Mithridates recalled dozens of young women scarred or erased during those final years. Some vanished entirely, others lived on in silence, ghosts behind silk curtains. It was never lust, he said. It was starvation, an endless hunger for control. By 466 BC, fear began spreading through the upper ranks. Artabanus had seen enough. He gathered a circle of nobles who had also witnessed the horrors. They called it a conspiracy, but it was really self-defense. They feared not divine wrath, but contamination. The idea that Xerxes' madness could infect their own households, that their wives and daughters might be next. The plan they conceived was simple. During the New Year festival, when the king withdrew alone for his nightly ritual of divine meditation, they would strike. Artabanus and his men would slip through the inner gate, kill him swiftly, and stage the scene as ritual suicide. No talk of justice, only stability. The empire had to survive, even if truth didn't. But Xerxes was no longer merely paranoid. He was prophetic in his suspicion. He saw betrayal in every eye, treachery in every whisper. Servants vanished for smiling too long. Ministers were executed for speaking softly. He had turned Persepolis into a labyrinth of fear. In his final months, he refused to leave the arena. Surrounded only by eunuchs and trembling women, he trusted no one else. The air inside grew thick with incense and dread. Then came the night of August 4, 465 BC. Xerxes chose his youngest victim yet, an 11-year-old girl who hadn't even reached womanhood. For weeks he had her watched, waiting for her body to change, for the moment she would be ready for his ritual. The palace was silent that evening, the kind of silence that comes before catastrophe. What happened next would end an empire and carve Xerxes' name into history, not as a god, but as a warning. That night, impatience finally crushed caution. Artabanus and his co-conspirators had waited for weeks, watching for the smallest crack in the emperor's routine. When they learned that Xerxes would visit the arena alone, guarded only by eunuchs who never left their posts outside the chamber, they knew it was their only chance. The guards, following sacred protocol, were forbidden from entering when the divine ritual began. That left the tunnels beneath the kitchens, the secret arteries of the palace, unguarded. Artabanus led his men through those narrow corridors where the smell of cooked meats mixed with the stench of old incense. They moved in silence, armed with daggers instead of swords. There would be no second attempt. When they reached the emperor's private chamber, they saw what no man should have to see. Xerxes, the king of kings, the living god of Persia, was naked, drenched in sweat, restraining a small girl who cried without sound. His face was unrecognizable, a grotesque mask of madness and obsession. Years of unchecked power had erased whatever was left of his humanity. His swollen body bore the marks of indulgence, his hands slick with the blood of his own child. For a moment, even seasoned soldiers froze. The image of the divine ruler had been replaced by that of a beast. Artabanus acted first. He struck once straight through the ribs, piercing the emperor's heart. Xerxes turned, eyes wide, not in pain or fear, but disbelief. He looked at his assassin, as though the world itself had betrayed him. His final words, recorded later by Artabanus himself, were chilling, "But I am God." The second blade sliced through his throat. The third was unnecessary, a final act of rage and release that tore through his abdomen. The King of Kings collapsed across the girl's small body, his royal blood mingling with hers on the cold marble floor. The conspirators lifted his corpse, washed the wounds, and laid him in his ceremonial bed. They positioned his hands as if in prayer, lit the sacred fire, and announced to the court that the emperor had died peacefully during his nightly communion with Ahura Mazda. The lie became official truth before dawn. The empire could not afford a scandal. By morning, the throne had a new occupant, Artaxerxes I, son of Xerxes. His first act as ruler was to order the arena sealed forever. Publicly, he declared it an act of reverence toward his father's sacred memory. Privately, he wanted to erase every trace of the nightmare that had rotted the heart of Persepolis. The surviving women were quietly relocated to other palaces across the empire. Many were hastily married to provincial nobles. Others were sent to temples to live out their days as priestesses. None remained in Persepolis. Their names never entered the royal archives. No poet sang for them. No historian recorded their suffering. They became the invisible dead forgotten by history, remembered only by stone. The eunuchs who had served in the arena met their own quiet extermination. One by one, they were executed for fabricated crimes, theft, blasphemy, conspiracy. In truth, they were silenced because they knew. Mithridates, the last surviving guardian, was allowed to live just long enough to write a confession. His words, hidden for centuries, would resurface long after Persia itself had turned to dust. Xerxes' body was mummified according to Zoroastrian tradition and laid to rest in the royal necropolis of Naksh-e-Rustam, carved deep into the cliffside. The tomb still stands, bearing inscriptions that praise him as King of Kings, Protector of the weak, Beloved of the divine light. But the walls say nothing of the daughters he destroyed, the lives erased to feed his ego. No word of the horrors behind the golden curtains, no trace of the girls who died nameless within his palace. For 2,000 years, history remembered Xerxes for something else entirely, his failed campaign against Greece. Greek chroniclers, like Herodotus, mocked his arrogance, retelling his defeat at Salamis and Plataea. Later, Persian historians minimized his rule. describing it as an unremarkable bridge between the reigns of Darius and Artaxerxes. No one mentioned the arena, no one spoke of the girls, and that silence may have been Xerxes' final triumph, to have committed atrocities so vast that even time itself conspired to bury them. But stone does not forget. In 1931, French archaeologists excavating the ruins of Persepolis uncovered something the official records never dared to mention. Beneath the marble floors of what had once been the royal harem, they found an underground chamber filled with human remains, hundreds of small skeletons, most belonging to girls between the ages of 10 and 12. Many bore evidence of repeated injury and prolonged confinement. Some were missing limbs. Others showed signs of deliberate mutilation. Among the debris, fragments of jewelry and shards of perfumed vases still lingered, a grotesque reminder of beauty used to decorate suffering. Laboratory studies confirmed what Mithridates had confessed centuries earlier, that the King of Kings not only enslaved and defiled the girls within his palace, but ended their lives once they no longer served his purpose. The royal harem had not been a sanctuary. It was an execution ground hidden beneath silks and gold. Even today, when tourists walk among the ruins of Persepolis and marvel at its grand columns and intricate reliefs, few realize what lies beneath their feet. The stone carvings celebrate victory, order, and divine power. But under those same stones rests a mass grave, a silent reminder that behind the glory of empires often lies the suffering of the powerless. This is the untold story of Xerxes I, the so-called King of Kings. Not the one taught in classrooms, full of battles and monuments, but the one written in the blood of his own daughters. He wasn't just an emperor defeated by Greece, he was a man destroyed by his own delusion of godhood. And this is how civilizations die, not with swords or sieges, but when moral decay eats away at their foundations from within. Because when a kingdom is built on suffering, its strength is an illusion. Sooner or later, it collapses under the weight of the pain it tried to hide. Today, in the silent ruins of Persepolis, among the shattered reliefs and broken stairways, the echoes of those forgotten girls still seem to whisper through the dust. Their voices say what no inscription ever did, that the true legacy of tyrants is not the monuments they build, but the lives they destroy. And no matter how many centuries pass, cruelty never truly disappears. It leaves traces in the stones, in the bones, and in the collective memory of those willing to look beneath the surface. If this story unsettled you, share it, because silence protects monsters, and when we stop remembering the crimes of the past, we risk creating new ones in the present. If you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, subscribe to this channel. Here, we uncover the stories official history tried to silence.